Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the New Year lecture of the Cluster of Excellence Africa Multiple at the University of Bayreuth. My name is Franz Kogelmann. I'm the Managing Director of this Cluster of Excellence, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the third New Year lecture. Unfortunately, the pandemic will not allow us to hold this important academic event as a live event this year. Like last year, the New Year lecture will take place as an online event. The choreography of this event is as follows. We were able to win Professor Yacouba Banhoro for the welcome address, Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofo for the introduction of the New Year lecture, and Professor Peter Simatei for the lecture. Both Professor Yacouba Banhoro and Professor Peter Simatei are directors of our African cluster centers at University Ki-Zerbo in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and Moi University in Eldoret, Kenya, respectively. Professor Akosua Adomako Ampofo, Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana in Legon, chairs the advisory board of the Cluster of Excellence. As a special innovation, I would like to point out that this event will also be simultaneously translated into international sign language. There will also be a panel discussion at the end of the New Year lecture. It will be chaired by Professor Susan Arndt. Please do not run away after the lecture, but participate actively. Please note that this discussion will be recorded. A special thanks goes to our student assistants, Ms. Lili Geisler and Ms. Stefanie Jassert, and our team assistant, Ms. Constanze Rau. Well, I wish you a happy New Year, a happy New Year lecture.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and dear students. Welcome to this third annual lecture of the Cluster of Excellence Africa Multiple. I am Dr. Yacouba Banhoro, Professor of History and Director of the African Cluster Center at the University Joseph Ki-Zerbo in Burkina Faso. I am very delighted on behalf of the administration and all the members of the cluster to welcome you to this third annual lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Peter Simatei, Professor of Comparative Literature, Dean of the School of Arts and Social Sciences, and Director of the African Cluster Center at Moi University in Kenya. To begin with, let me wish you all a happy new year. May 2022 be the beginning of the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no doubt that, as in 2020, this pandemic was the major contingency to the normal and full functioning of the cluster activities in 2021. Nevertheless, our Centers of Excellence, Africa Multiple, did not stop its scientific endeavor, which is to reconfigure African studies. Established in January 2019 by the University of Bayreuth, Africa Multiple is a universities-based partnership engaging not only the African universities of Lagos in Nigeria, Rhodes in South Africa, Eldoret in Kenya, Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso, and the University of Bayreuth, but also long-standing partners consisting of African studies centers around the world. The desire in this partnership to reconfigure African studies through the interaction of researchers from different disciplines and different backgrounds in the production of knowledge on Africa allows today a professor from the University Joseph Ki-Zerbo of Ouagadougou to welcome the guests to a lecture delivered from Kenya on behalf of a network of researchers based in different places in the world. If the COVID-19 pandemic has brought some restrictions to our activities, it has also been an opportunity to develop and intensify remote digital communication, and cluster members seized this opportunity in those exhausting times to go forward with their common endeavor of transregional collaborative research. In fact, during 2021, virtual communications between the members of our cluster and their international partners have been multiplied. This has given even more meaning to our digital research environment project, one of the pillars of collaboration between the different universities as well as of the reconfiguration of African studies. Thanks to this last digital communication revolution, including the popularization of Zoom, the statutory meetings of the Cluster of Excellence could be held online or in a hybrid manner. The lectures and workshops in the Knowledge Lab and in the 6 research sections were also held in the same way. Collaborations through research projects took place either through physical meetings when possible or through virtual meetings when appropriate. In each of African cluster center, despite the obstacles related to COVID-19, promises of activities have been fulfilled. Conferences, workshops, writing of research projects, research, training of young researchers, integration of gender and diversity in our research activities, fieldwork, publication of scientific articles and books are activities that we have carried out during the year 2021 in the spaces of freedom gained naturally or artificially at the expense of the COVID-19 pandemic. The second international conference of the Africa Multiple Center of Excellence on African Relations, held in July 2021, was a cornerstone of our collaboration in 2021, and it kept all its promises, even though it was held online and in an hybrid manner. Let me remind, in the words of the cluster's dean, Professor Dr. Rüdiger Zesemann, that the concept of the annual New Year lecture of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence stipulates to be one of the first cluster events in the new year, creating an official opening of the academic events of the year. In January 2020, Professor Dr. Zesemann introduced this series of annual New Year lectures, focusing in his lecture on reconfiguration of African studies. In January 2021, the second anniversary was marked by the lecture given by the cluster's Vice Dean of Internationalization, Professor Dr. Ute Fendler, specialist of African films and literature studies, who addressed relationalities in African art. Going forward, on key concepts of the Cluster of Excellence, on the potential of language studies as a way of reconfiguring African studies, Professor Dr. Simatei will talk about ways of knowing Africa, African literature, and shifting imaginaries. I thank Professor Peter Simatei for accepting to deliver this 3rd anniversary lecture of the cluster. To end, I would like to congratulate the administration of the Cluster of Excellence, as well as all its members, for their work during the past 2 years under exhausting conditions due to the pandemic. We still have a long way to go, and we are looking forward to ways and means to improve our partnership and focus on our goals. I wish you a very good New Year's lecture.
Greetings. My name is Yacouba Banhoro. I'm at the Institute of African Studies, Professor of African and Gender Studies here at the University of Ghana, and Chair of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence Board. Last month, we lost 2 formidable individuals who have shared a lot of wisdom with us and have now gone on to become our ancestors. And I want to greet you with some very simple words from both that speak, I believe, to the times we're in, as well as the lecture that we will hear shortly. Bell Hooks says, "What we cannot imagine cannot come into being." And the Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, "We need other human beings in order to be human." Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dr. Simatei to deliver the 3rd New Year lecture of the cluster. He is in good company after the inaugural lecture delivered by Professor Dr. Ute Fendler in 2020, followed by Professor Dr. Rüdiger Zesemann in 2021. Professor Dr. Simatei is the ACC Director of Moore University and the first member from one of our African cluster centers to be delivering the new year lecture titled Ways of Knowing Africa, African Literature and Shifting Imaginaries. Now you understand bell hooks. Peter Simatei is a professor of comparative literature and dean of the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Moore University, Kenya. Sometimes it is interesting to know what people studied and where, so just fun facts for your information. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Literature and Political Science from the University of Nairobi, an MPhil from Moore University, where his thesis was on images of post-colonial relationships in the writings of Carol Phillips. And Carol Phillips is a Caribbean British novelist, playwright, and essayist in the genre of Black Atlantic writing. So we have a sense of what's in store for us. And Professor Simatei holds a PhD from the University of Bayreuth. His thesis was titled The Novel and the Politics of Nation Building in East Africa. Thus, to note that Professor Simatei works in the intersecting fields of post-colonial studies, Anglophone literatures, and diaspora studies should be unsurprising. His research enjoys international standing in post-colonial literary and cultural studies, with specialization in the areas of East African, African and Indian diaspora literature, and popular culture. He focuses on negotiations of diaspora, migration, and gender and popular culture, and seeks to understand the ways in which diaspora and diasporic identities work within, against, and or around national identities. And his work makes an important intervention in theories of diaspora that sometimes all too easily discount the centrality of the nation state to diasporic consciousness. Some of his publications include, in 2019, Pleasures of the Flesh, the image of the prostitute in African literature, in an edited collection titled Routledge International Handbook of Sex Industry Research, published in 2019. In 2016, he has an article titled A Gloss on Perspectives for the Study of African Literature versus Greek and Oriental Traditions, which was published in Our Mythical Childhood, the Classics and Literature for Children and Young Adults. 2011, there's a publication that should interest many of us in diaspora studies, East African studies, African studies more broadly around the contestations of nation building at the state. And it's titled Diasporic Memories and National Histories in East African Asian Writing. I found this one as well, and Kanlenyin Popular Music and the Contestation of National Space in Kenya, published in 2010 in the Journal of East African Studies. So you get a sense of both the breadth of his work, but also the particularities. He has been active in many spheres, including as a fellow of the 5-College African Scholars Program at the University of Massachusetts in the US, and as a Humboldt Fellow in Germany. And it is now my very sincere and deep pleasure to invite Professor Simatei to share his insights with us. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm delighted to give this third New Year lecture of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. It's always a pleasure, of course, to be in Bayreuth, although this time we are only present virtually. The title of my talk, as you probably already know, is Ways of Knowing Africa, African Literature and Shifting Imaginaries. The first part of my title, Ways of Knowing Africa, is an obvious intertextual gesture towards the politics of knowledge production in relation to Africa. How is knowledge of, in, and about Africa constituted or configured? These are questions, of course, that have been addressed and continue to be addressed in many scholarly debates, and the critical questions continue to revolve around Africa as an object of knowledge. And perhaps more importantly, is the question of Africa's relationship to that very project of knowing. These projects have produced an array of conceptual grammars subsumed under terms such as ways of seeing Africa, thinking Africa differently, Africa Knows, and of course our own project Reconfiguring African Studies, and many others that attempt to shape the field of African studies, and in so doing contest colonial and hegemonic imposition of particular ways of seeing Africa. My interest today, though, is to simply, in a general way, reflect a bit on the role that African literature has played and continues to play in the reconstitution of ways of knowing Africa and in the production of new conceptions of African subjectivities, African ways of life, and modes of relations. This, of course, is a broad topic, and given that African literature is itself a field of complex and diverse literary texts, traditions, cultures, and languages, my talk will be sort of a general assessment of the field. I want to begin with Ari Karupa's reflection on the first question of the role of the African writer and artist in society. Of course, these were issues that were quite relevant in the decolonization period, where writers foisted upon themselves or were bestowed by society the role of guiding their people to be proper subjects of their own cultures and histories. Karupa writes, for most post-colonial literatures or literatures from emergent literary spaces, literary value inheres as much in the teachability of the text as it does in whatever other aesthetic qualities it may possess. That is, the text's ability to illustrate, rework, or represent some theme or issue considered to be of major significance, and to open it up for teaching about empire, nation, and identity, or post-nation, diaspora, and globalization, for instance. This as much is a source of value as any of its other formal qualities. Karupa then goes to argue for what he calls the teacherly texts, texts that enact the struggle over different articulations of the structure of social relations, or different narratives of the forms of subjectivity, gender relations, sexuality, social order, and so forth and so forth. Karupa's argument here partly defines what one can call the cognitive projects of African literature and the knowledge about relations, human relations, that one can unlock from the text through attention to their aesthetics. Unlike in the informative discourses and practices, where knowledge is perhaps propositional, the knowledge that literature affords, or the truths and the insights about the human condition that it leads us to, come in forms that question our normative practices and provide new categories for apprehending the world. In addressing emerging African realities, African literature, at least in its written form, has gone through different but interrelated phases, with shifts in thematic engagements, reconstitutions of new spatial temporal configurations, and stylistic innovations. The starting point for the mapping of these different phases is limited in the context of my talk. Here, we might want to probably begin with colonialism. And I'm quite aware of the criticism of this kind of periodization that frames Africa's longer pre-colonial existence in terms of linearities of imperial history. In fact, African literature, both oral and written, exists and existed outside what we now call modern African literature, which is a recent phenomenon. And this has been well documented by scholars like Simon Kikandi and so forth. But as Swati Barashas and Michel Schulz assert, to study Africa without invoking the colonial era legacies remains one of the major epistemological challenges. And this is something that all of us have to grapple with. Modern African literature especially has a complex symbiotic relationship with colonialism, and this has been captured better by Simon Kikandi when he writes, modern African literature was produced in the crucible of colonialism, but what is now considered to be the heart of literary scholarship on the continent could not have acquired its current identity or function if the traumatic encounter between Africa and Europe had not taken place. Not only were the founders of modern African literature colonial subjects, writes Kikandi, but colonialism was also to be the most important and enduring theme in their works. And therefore, it became the case then that the specificity of African literature, its distinctiveness, is marked in part by its relation to imperial history. This literature is not only about the history of imperial subjugation of African peoples and their resistance to it, it's also its product. But it's also more than all this in the sense that while it has articulately projected the complex interplay of the forces shaping the destiny of the African people, this literature actively intervenes in the making of that history. Hence, one historical function it has served and continues to serve is that of mapping out unique political, cultural consciousness as part of a larger project of liberating the African person from the debilitating conditions created by imperialism. And as Kramhagen writes, like other post-colonial literatures, African literature might be seen in very general terms as having both a recuperative and a deconstructive dimension. Recuperative insofar as it conscripts the literary text into the service of a continually refashioned cultural identity. Deconstructive insofar as it plays on and challenges Western readerly expectation, and in so doing works towards dismantling self-privileging Western modes of vision and thought. At least this was the agenda of the pioneer African writers writing up to probably early 1980s. And in fact, a number of them in their critical essays affirmed that this indeed was their mission and that their relevance to society lay in the conscious intervention in the unfolding of history. What comes to mind quickly, of course, is the famous and often quoted assertion by Chinua Achebe on the role of the African writer in the period of decolonization, where he sees the role of the writer as that of re-education and regeneration that must be done after colonialism. This is the role that he expected his novels to play, and especially those of his novels that are set in the past. This very well-known quote, I put it here: "I will be quite satisfied if my novels, especially the ones I set in the past, did no more than teach my readers that their past, with all its imperfections, was not one long night of savagery from which the first Europeans acting on God's behalf delivered them." Ngugi wa Thiong'o's position, of course, is well known and well studied and well discussed, so I will not really rehearse his politics of decolonization here. But let me quickly mention that, like other writers of that age, Ngugi envisaged literary text as embodying a structure of values dialectically opposed to those of the ruling class, of the oppressing race and nation. This may sound simplistically Manichaean, but it's not. Because in writing against colonial culture and world, the African writer seeks to organize a whole new reality whose contradistinction to the colonial one would be defined not only in terms of its emancipatory potential, but also in the foregrounding of the African as the center of this world. This does not imply that African literature functions in such simplistic manner by merely inverting and negating colonialist values. It is to admit instead that African literature emerges into being through resistance to conditions that deny possibilities of its existence, to establish in the process what Omi Baba would call spaces of surplus and signification, where totalization is resisted and the calculation of power is disturbed. In a sense, then, we're talking about decolonization as a cultural and political project of African literature in that early phase of the immediate post-colonial period. The concern of African texts was, or is still, not only to decolonize the cultures and histories of the African peoples, Or to put it differently, using, of course, this diet phrase, it is not only that they write back to the empire in contestation of European misrepresentations of the continent, it also seeks to reveal the subtle and indigenized forms which oppressive power has taken in the post-colonial or so-called post-national era. Hence, questions of how colonial power relations endures through the post-colonial state and how it continues to shape everyday life of the people as it subjugates them to its hegemonic interest constitute the central concerns of a significant number of African writers. If it is actually this reading of the post-colonial state as a reconfiguration of colonial power that sets the stage for African literature, so for African literature's delegitimation of the nationalist project, and with it, the freeing of literary imagination from the burdens of homogeneity, autochthony, authenticity, and essentialism that defined the nation-building projects in the first place. But this, of course, opens up new debates even as we move away from prescriptive agendas for African literature. What kind of Africa do we glimpse from the emerging literatures of the 21st century? Or to put it differently, what kind of stories are coming out of Africa in the 21st century? These questions have been subject of intense scholarly debates as critics try to define the nature of the new literatures from Africa. The consensus seems to be that the periodization we are seeking in order to delineate the new form from the old is not only impossible, but perhaps not even necessary, given the fact that, and here I quote Lindsay Green Sims, given the fact that 21st century African writing is by no means monolithic, and is certainly still informed both by the stories of previous generations and by the tragic topics of war, anger, and violence. I know this is quite controversial, especially when we start touching themes like war, anger, and violence, as most other writers think that this is what people should be running away from. Writers that frequently top the list of that generation of African writers, of course, include Chimamanda Adichie, Teju Cole, Dino Mengistu, Nafalet Bulawayo, Ellen Abila, and, of course, Binyavanga Wainaina. In a sense, one notes in these writings a kind of a disavowal of both the politics of decolonization and of identity formations within the confines of national spaces, as they seek to address emerging identities in the transnational and cosmopolitan locations and diasporic spaces from where they are created. Writing from these locations give rise to texts that affirm the multiple, hybrid, and fluid identities of Africans in the metropolitan capitals of the West, but who remain subjects of global power structures. While the task of the pioneer African writer was to reclaim community from within the boundaries defined by colonialism, contemporary writings, written as it were from transnational locations, grapples with realities generated by fluid, overlapping, and sometimes conflicting spaces. It has been argued by some scholars, for example, that the eschewal of nationalist politics and espousal of a post-nationalist ethic liberates the African writer from the burden of embodying the story and the politics of the nation. Of course, this is not a new concern or a new debate. It definitely recalls the debate that followed Frederick Jameson's sweeping categorization of third world literatures as mere national allegories, which, in a sense, is a totalizing view that sought, in the words of John Early, to impose a theoretical template to quite divergent writings, falsely rendering it all quite accessible and familiar. In analytical terms, I think Jameson's totalization glosses over the complex functions of these literatures. The critical theoretical issue here is that African literature is, in its different phases of development, which, as I have said, are interrelated, do not present unmediated access to African realities. It instead participates in their constitution and problematization of Africa's understanding of its multiple self through what Cram-Agan has called structured interplay between modified local and imported aesthetic traditions, their cultivated ambiguities, their subtle modulations of voice and perspective in the multifaceted portrayal of the various cultural environments they represent. As I conclude, let me briefly discuss a new kind of writing that sometimes falls under the broad category or rubric of Indian Ocean Imaginaries, but which in Eastern and Southern African scholarship is often categorized or read in universities as African Indian or Asian literatures. This is the writing that is produced by the third and fourth generation of the Indian diaspora in East Africa and Southern Africa, and is therefore often designated as a form of diasporic writing, just as is the case with the third generation of African writers writing from outside the continent. Like in the latter, these writings contest and transform relations based on national rootedness and territorial logic. Their fictional works affirm the multiple histories to which they are heir. The transnational nature of their present realities becomes fictionalized in their texts, an engagement that maps diasporic politics as a critical feature of their writing. Also amplified in their writings are the pet concerns of diaspora discourses that include the politics of home and belonging in displacement, the ambivalence of the post-colonial situation, the polyvalent nature of cultural identities and histories within the post-colony, and the coexistence of a multiplicity of cultural cartographies associated with it. For this kind of literature, the constitution of alternative imaginaries involves not only the translation of a national space that is recast by nationalist narratives as, to borrow from Afrodi, staple, culturally homogeneous, historically unchanging. It also means writing a deterritorialized diaspora, one that does not return unbounded category of people not connected with a specific homeland. What is imagined here are individual identities that are malleable, hybrid, and multiple. In other words, this literature counters two kinds of essentialism. One is constructed within the nation state and colonial state, where the national people and territory are understood in homogeneous and exclusionary terms. The other essentialism, of course, comes with concepts of diaspora that revive notions of belonging and the roots of migrants in places of origin. These texts affirm the multiple and fluid identities in diasporic experiences as the subjectivities that enable the East African Asian migrant in Europe and North America, for example, to visualize he or herself as belonging to both East Africa and elsewhere, or here and there, and in between the two spaces simultaneously. Thus, the diasporic perspective adopted by these writings revolves the East African nation state by problematizing the relationship between descendant and hybrid memories of a diasporic subject and the supposedly stable and homogeneous memory formations constituted within the nation state. In this case, diaspora and the diasporic identities work within, against, and or around national identities to construct plural spaces for enacting the difference of the diasporic subject. This is well demonstrated in most writings by East African Asian writers, but just one example from Moyes Fasanji's novel, The In-Between World of Vikram Lal, where Fasanji revisits India's ambivalent relationship with Kenya's national history. Unlike in the early novels, such as The Canisac and The Book of Secrets, where the concern is about the impossibility of belonging to and the inevitability of departure from East Africa. This latter novel demonstrates the Asian's complex entanglement with Kenya's equally contested histories. It is in locating East African Indian writing within the historical circumstances of its production that we begin to understand how this diaspora constitutes a space that is, to borrow from Jones and others, contextually embedded in other spaces by virtue of constitutive relations they share with other places, things, practices, and persons. In other words, a diasporic space is an intersectional space. This space, to appropriate Andhia's terms, translocational, a term she uses to describe the ways in which social locations are products of particular constellations of social relations, and in terms of relationality and experience at determinate points in time. It points, she says, to the existence of contradictory and shifting social locations where one might be in a position of dominance and subordination simultaneously, on the one hand, or at different times or spaces or the other. In a sense, the diasporic subject is caught within intersecting social and even national boundaries. If anything, the diasporic subject is defined not only by the multiplicity of locations and identities it's heir to, but also by the convergence of pluralistic spaces and temporalities. The narrator in Jamila Siddiqui's novel, The Feast of the Nine Virgins, contemplates this kind of multiple realities thus. Born in Bombay, raised in Mombasa, married in Kampala, educated in London, worked in Tehran, lived in New York, then Stuttgart, then Hong Kong, and died in Vancouver. Where was this person actually from? Where is anyone from these days? Where do they live? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Dr. Peter Simatei, for doing the impossible thing, for talking about African literatures from past, present, future, from nation to diaspora all across the world in 23 minutes. So thank you so much for this inspiring talk. And now we have 40 minutes for Q&A, and everyone is welcome to join. We thought it would be a good idea that you can raise your hand, and then you are invited to pose your question to Professor Simatei or to comment on it. And so I see Remy Chukwuti.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Hello to Byron, to everyone. I have maybe two questions, if I may ask Susan. The first one is connected to the history even of the cluster Africa Multiple. There are some colleagues here around Susan. If you remember the starting point of what we now call reconfiguring was knowing Africa. And I remember this retreat we had during which the question of knowing, claiming to knowing Africa is very Western and arrogant. Now here we go, Professor Simatei from Kenya, speaking of knowing Africa. So this is my first question. Can one really claim to knowing Africa? The second question, in your title, is also connected to your title in your talk. You're speaking about African literature in the singular form. And in your talk, you mentioned only writers from African diaspora writing in English. At least this is what I got. What about the writers in Gikuyu, Swahili, Tigrinya, all these languages, which represent the continent? Can we speak of African literature in singular? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see any other raised hand right now, but I would love to come in here also, so to making a follow-up from Remy's question, Peter, because you inspired me very much with just, as I said, going through so many fields and having so many inspiring thoughts. But I also wanted to pick up what Akosua said, quoting bell hooks in the beginning, what we cannot imagine cannot become into being. And I think this is a very legitimacy for our field, literary studies, right? Because actually, I think Glissant also talks about it. Sometimes we fail to understand, to grasp what is happening, but imagination always opens a new field where you can enter possibilities that are not yet there, and by entering them you can pave the way and create dreams, hopes, interventions. And so you also talk very much about imagination and African realities in the very intersection, and talking also about Achebe's great vision. We as writers, we can intervene into what colonialism did, but this is of course ongoing, right? So literature keeps intervening, and so which role do you see in us as scholars of literature? Remy's one being two, you as well, of course, but very, very much also being and the urge of not just analyzing knowledge production in the fiction, but doing knowledge production. And I think this also refers to what Remy just said. So how would that affect our own course of studies, studying African literature? So is this any category that is still viable, relevant in the 21st century? Because as you said, this is a container term that bridges nations, via diasporas throughout the continent, that bridges past, present, and future. So what does reconfiguring African studies mean to our field of studying African literatures? Isn't sort of this time now that we have something like Nigerian literatures, Kenyan literatures, which then could also integrate the linguistic varieties even more clearly, giving certain historical and present and future settings to that. So what is your thought on this? Since I don't at the hand exactly, Peter, maybe you can come in and answer.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Well, Remy, that is a real good question that you asked, and like I said, I sort of took a very broad view of the of the field, trying to make general statements about African literature. Of course, you are so right that yeah, maybe we're also victims of of our own discrimination when it comes to literature, where we actually I spoke about all this and did not even mention literature in Kiswahili, even after quoting Ngugi, who actually insists that we should do African literature in African languages. So yeah, that was, well, a little bit a confusion of the fact that I took a very broad view of this. But Remy, you're right. Yeah, we and like I said, these are very complex field. So even to talk about African literature is itself complicated in the first place. Because once you say African literature, it's as if you are actually talking about a field that has been discussed and defined, which is not really true. You understand the politics of definition of African literature, the Makerere Conference and so forth, which actually I think at some point, the writers themselves accepted that you are not going to define African literature. Let African literature define itself. Let it come. You remember the famous Soinka phrase, the Taika and so forth. So it was like, let African literature emerge, and it will define itself. So you're right, Remy, that I was a little bit I agree that that was not the best way to go, because when you talk about African literatures, you already almost assume, that this is a field that can be defined, but which cannot actually. So, I was just talking generally about African literature and knowing Africa. And really, you are right, because I was also like, yeah, and that's why I said like that first title, the first part of my lecture, so-called Knowing Africa. That is exactly what I thought. I found it interesting that this knowing thing, what's it all about? What I didn't do in my talk was to actually discuss that bit of knowing Africa. What's all these things? And I like Remy because you asked a very good question. What is this idea of knowing? We should know. And you are like, how can Simatei talk about knowing Africa and he's talking from Africa, that kind of thing. So it's interesting politics of politics of knowledge production and politics of trying to understand other people and so forth and so forth. So once in a while we get caught in that. Well, Susan, yeah, that was a good question and comment. And I totally, of course, go with you on the issues that you have raised completely. These are areas that are so complex, and yeah, we cannot, seem to know really that that we can talk about literature in African literature in one word and so forth. So I think, yeah, I take those comments very very seriously. Thank you for that, Susan. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, this imagination as knowing, I think that is.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, you're right, because you see, actually you're right. Yeah, I forgot about that, because this writing is also a way of figuring other worlds, and most of them are like fictional works. Yeah, fictional worlds. And what's interesting, for example, in African literature is that there's a lot of imagination about the possibilities of what should have, probably taken place as a nation, probably as a country, and I think writers have their own right to imagine what should have been possible, and in the process, of course, they criticize the presence. They criticize what's happening, what's going on. This is not what should have been. That kind of thinking. So we have these fictional worlds, sometimes very beautiful, sometimes very very ironic worlds against the ones that we live. Sometimes very utopic in a way. Utopian nations, like the way Google, for example, tries to construct a kind of a socialist utopia. I think it's also because, of course, yeah, it's like there could have been a possibility of doing this thing differently. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. I saw Eunice. Do you want to invite?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Simatei for a brilliant presentation. It's so successful that in 23 minutes, you've been able to raise so much energy, in the room, and so much response. That's great. But to follow up on the conversation around knowing Africa, I think we don't ever know anything, leave alone Africa. Africa is so complicated, but so are other spaces. And I doubt that we ever get to know anything that probably you would have considered a topic like exploring Africa. We are permanently exploring even ourselves. And I'm thinking about the comment you made about this person that is born in one part of the world, grows up, I don't know where, visits where, ends up dying, I don't know where, And I'm thinking that's just, you're only touching the surface of human identity and the construction and deconstructions of those identities and moralities, for that matter. Because it's not just the physical movement. Human beings are always moving in this world, because as we are doing right now, you are in Bayreuth and you're not in Bayreuth, you know? Yes, you are experiencing, I am experiencing Bayreuth right now. And so it's going to define my next thinking, my next identity of myself. So life is a little too complicated. And especially when you begin thinking about the human person, because the human person is not just the body, there is also the spirit that hovers all over, so that you can't restrict or restrain the African to remain in Africa. Even those who have traveled, like you said, who are in the diaspora, they may have been born in Germany, for example, and their parents may even have been born in Germany, but that doesn't stop them from having an African experience, because they may be reading about their ancestors and their ancestors may be communicating with them. So I'm just thinking how complicated this subject is, and I'm so excited that Africa Multiple is thinking of reconfiguring African studies, even though we don't know what this African studies is. Thank you. That's just a comment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Yunus. Thanks for that comment. Actually, you're right. You know, like, I think I should have said that when I use the word, you know, ways of knowing Africa, I meant it to be ironic, actually, you know, that there's no, there are never, actually, there's no one way of knowing Africa, because Africa is as complex as it comes, you know, that kind of thing. So you're right. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you from my end, dear Eunice Camarero. And we have two more questions. One from Christopher Odhiambo, and the second one by Akimayova Akin Otiko. I think I saw your hand, as well as Kinua Neri. So maybe we have the three questions in a row.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter, for that very interesting presentation that covers quite a lot. But I'm just wondering, when we're talking about knowing Africa through African literature, and wondering about the polemics that were raised about knowing Africa through African literature by the works of Chinwezu et al. Towards the decolonization of African literature. So how do we know Africa when we already contesting the imaginations of African writers who are also trying to know Africa through certain forms of aesthetics? What would be your comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, and we collect, and then Akin Mayova. We cannot hear you properly.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, excellent.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. So I want to react to, well, beautiful talk to start with. Thank you very much, Professor Peter. And it's thought-provoking. I want to react to the question of possibility of knowing Africa or not knowing Africa. I think I'm not too comfortable with saying you cannot know Africa. To say that Africa is complex is already knowing Africa, because you're already saying something about Africa. Not to be able to know Africa means reconfiguring African studies. It's impossible. So what I want us to begin to do is to begin to speak to the complexity of Africa. And in speaking to the complexity of Africa means we're going to be taking aspects. What we had in the past is generalizations and overgeneralizations. So if we begin to take aspects of Africa, then we're gradually speaking to Africa and about Africa. I don't feel comfortable when we say we cannot know Africa. Africa is knowable. That's why we're discussing Africa. Africa has multiple facets. Africa has multiple aspects. Africa is dynamic in its culture. And I think we need to begin to settle for that, so that even if it is a very minute part of Africa we speak about, that is Africa. That is an aspect of Africa. So to say we cannot know Africa, maybe it wouldn't sit well with some person like me. We can know Africa. Gradually, we can begin to speak about the aspects of Africa. And I think that is what reconfiguring Africa is all about. It means we're going from generalization and overgeneralization to speaking particular and to speaking specific about Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then we take Kinua, and then it's your turn again, Peter.
Hello, okay. I am Kinua Njeri, and I am so excited to be part of this conversation, and especially when it's one that deals with knowing Africa. First, I am blessed to have studied literature at the university, and I would authoritatively support Professor Simatei when he says that Africa is quite complicated. Why? Because, for instance, we come from the exact same country with Professor Peter Simatei, but we don't have the same culture. And if we were to look at literature as the only source of understanding the African person, we would have a very hard time, because you first must understand Peter as a different entity from Kinua Njeri. His way of doing things is so different from mine. And certainly his literature would be affected from his creativity that, of course, comes from his environment and that of his culture. Then a lot has been told about Africa, but it all depends on who was telling our story. If you read the history of Africa, you'll always realize that it is always biased depending on who was telling our story. I'm so excited right now to know that most Africans are telling their story. And now we will no longer have that kind of victimization where we think, oh, they said bad things about us. No, no, no. They said the things they said. They wrote the things they wrote, depending on where they came from, and they have all the rights. The writer has the right to kill a story. And I'm just very excited to be part of this conversation, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Susan, I think those are very, very, very good and great comments, by the way. Kinua is right. I mean, and so is my good friend from Nigeria, because you see, the big question about African literature, or rather literature in general, is that this is not information, as in you go and read African literature in order to know Africa. You don't go and read African literature in order to get some details about Africa. Like I said, it's not an anthropological textbook where you're like, okay, let me take Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God, and when I read it, I will understand the Yacouba society. We are saying that literature is also, complex in its own way. It relays information in its own special way as literature, and so we cannot say that today I'm going to take things fall apart, and from there I will know about the Yacouba culture, because literature is also literature. It complicates its own relay of information and realities. So what we are actually saying, like the question that CJ was asking, what we are actually saying is that we cannot pick a novel, for example, Petals of Blood by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and say that this one will give us a window into what happens in Kenya. We should be able to say, okay, this is a novel, and it complicates its own presentation of realities. So the literature that we must read as literature, and at the same time, we are like, okay, let's see what does it tell us about the cultures and values of Kenyan people. Like Njeri is saying, Ngugi will write and inject a lot of Kikuyu values and stuff like that, but which are also like representative of Kenyan cultures in a way. We should be able to say, okay, yeah, I think I get a glimpse of what happens in Kenya by reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o. When I went to the so-called African, five college African study project. A professor of history actually invited me to go and talk to his students about the novels. I think we discussed like 3 novels by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, others by Meja Mwangi, and I asked him, why are you teaching history students novels? And he told me that actually through novels we understand the very difficult issues about the country, and I was like, oh, that is very interesting. So like students come and you're like, before we start teaching you history of East Africa, can you read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between or Petals of Blood and so forth? So there's that element, but it's not that it's going to take the information that comes out of that novel as historical facts. No, it's the argument was that people will understand, the values, and vibes of Kenyan people through this before we start talking about Mau Mau and how colonialism, devastated Kenya and so forth. So I think, yeah, these are very, very interesting suggestions, and yeah, I'm happy about them.
Yeah, thank you so much for this eloquent discussion. And as my dear colleague, Dr. Kogemann said in the beginning, don't run away, but head towards the discussion. In this sense, we still have time for another round of comments or questions, maybe also covering other aspects that we've heard. Oh yes, I want to invite my dear colleague Tiku Muhammad to our discussion. And if there are 2 more, then we can make it a row and the last row before Peter will answer again. Clarissa Vierke then would be second after Diko. 1 more, otherwise we close the question round. Okay, then we close it here and have question from Diko. And we have Abisoya Elechin would be then the 3rd person. Okay, perfect.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you, Professor Peter Simatei. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. A lot has been said about, especially, most of the discussions are going back to the past, but I'm interested in the comments, like the quotation started by the professor from Ghana, from Bell Hooks. So, Professor Simatei, what do you think of the future when you look at the present kind of literary writings coming up from Africa? I'm curious about that. What do you think of the future? Most of the writers now, you see that they are just in a way joining part of the global conversations about climate, about race issues, about so many things, global justice and the others. So I don't know, what do you think of the future considering that? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a very good question, and there's a lot of debate, about future African writings, or like I mentioned about the new emerging writings, and which are actually written from what I call translocational spaces, and in most cases, these are young writers who are writing from wherever, Europe, US, wherever. And there's a lot of debate, writers are even fashioning themselves. You know, the debate about the, you know, is it Afropolitanism, that kind of thing. But I think what's happening is we have a situation where, you know, we have writers who get like, you know, focused by Western publishing houses and Western, you know, book prices, you know, and they get like, you know, they get elevated because of that. But we also have writers who struggle, you know, back home in Ghana, in Kenya, and so forth, with local publishers who might not even be able to, like, you know, market them and so forth. What I'm seeing is a situation, of course, where writers, you know, from, you know, the so-called diaspora, whatever that means. I mean, people are writing from the different global locations, begin to tell stories about Africans in those places, you know, and those stories begin to sell in that sense. You know, the more we have these writings from these locations, the more we begin to imagine a different reality for Africa. You know, in that sense, that people will write about issues facing Africans in Vienna, in, you know, in Germany, things like that. The question really is, what is the reality? You know, what is the reality back home? You know, and these stories that are written, you know, back in Ghana and Uganda and Somalia, how do they impact on the global understanding or the global idea about Africa? Okay, let me not use the term knowing Africa this time around, but what do they tell us about Africa? And what do the other stories tell us about Africa? You know, stories that are told in London by our own writers and who are focusing on cosmopolitan realities, and it's true, they live those lives and they have to write that story. So I'm seeing a situation where we're going to have a very interesting, complex, you know, sort of stories that emerge from the different places, but about Africa, through prisms of Europe, through prisms of, you know, Africa, and so forth. So I think we're going to have very interesting stories, let me put it that way. Thank you.
Yeah, we have Clarissa and Abisu. Yeah.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Peter, for a great presentation, and thanks, Susan. My question is, how does literary studies or comparative literary studies, does it need to reconfigure itself as well in its way of knowing Africa? So now I'm just quoting you. One thing is the language question, which Remy already raised, but the other thing, Spivak in her book Death of a Discipline, well, quite some time ago already said there is the market is kind of very eager to have diversity and the other. So it becomes very commercialized. How is their resistance possible, and how does literary studies also react to that? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe the last question also in, Peter, from Abisoya, and then you reply and have the final say.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. Very good presentation, Professor Simatei. This presentation reminds me of one of the discussions we have at the Lagos ACC on the real definition of Africa. This happened about a few months ago. And what this makes me to understand and to agree is that truly there's a problem of epistemology about Africa. Because number one, even for us to be talking about this at this stage, there's a problem. For us to be talking about this, even in this project, in this whole cluster thing, to be talking about the definition of Africa, then truly there's a problem about the knowledge of Africa. But I think that in a heavily heterogeneous society like Africa, it is just normal for us to have this kind of challenge. Of course, we know there are about over 2,000 cultures in Africa alone. How do we then conclude that this is what we mean when we define Africa as an entity? So I think what we need to look at is that Africa needs contextualization. We did a workshop in Lagos ACC about 2 months ago, and we talked about development in Africa. One of our takeaways was that development in Africa needs to be contextualized because we do not need to compare what we have in Africa with that of the other parts of the world. And I think that is the same thing. That is a kind of extension to the definition of what Africa is. And I can bet that this discussion will continue for God knows when, until we can all come together and decide on what we mean by Africa. And I don't see us doing that. The best we can do is to continue this kind of discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Fali. I think that's a great comment. Actually, I think we can actually agree that, like someone said, I think we can agree that Africa is unknowable, and that's why we keep saying ways of knowing Africa, those kind of things. But the other well, that was that was not being seriously. But I think the other question really is one that is captured by that Igbo phrase in Chinua Achebe's novels. That if you want to see, is it like if you want to see a mask dancing or something like that, you have to move from one position to the other. I think Africa is as complex as that, and we can only approach it from the different perspectives. If you want to, is it like if you want to, or is it like the world is like a mask dancing? If you want to understand it, you approach it from the different directions, and I think that's it about Africa. But I think you're also right. The question is why these issues of knowing Africa? Why not knowing Europe or something like that? But as we are in this business of reconfiguring African studies, I think the point really is let's know it from the different disciplinary perspectives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't see any further hand, and we are also very much close towards our end. So of course, we covered this huge field of knowing, and then we have who knows what is silenced by knowing, but imagination goes beyond that silencing, and we could go on for hours, and we hope to see your book published on this very soon. And maybe we could also have a workshop engaging more, because that was really inspiring. And so many thanks to all of you. And again, Happy New Year to all of you. May this talk inspire us for an ongoing, brilliant, nice, warm future collaboration. Take good care. Thanks again to all, and particularly, of course, to Peter and the entire team who made this event possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody.